Good afternoon. I'm Horace Moore Sr., this year's president of the Florida Free Speech Forum. Welcome to the April 12th, 2021 meeting of the Florida Free Speech Forum online. As we continue to confront pandemic issues, we are glad you have joined us. And we ask all of you now to make sure that your microphones are muted. Please note that this meeting is being recorded. Our theme during this session of COVID is conversations during a time of crisis. We are happy to be able to reach you safely through Zoom, and we look forward to continued topics over the next 2 months. For more information about the forum, you should visit our website at floridafreestreetforum.org. If you received an email invitation to this meeting, you are considered either a member or interested associate. Thank you. You will receive an email invitation prior to every meeting, which we will continue to have every second Monday of the month. We will be contacting you after our main meeting with instructions about applications for the year beginning in September. Our forum does not endorse candidates nor take sides on issues other than the critical issue of exercising our right to free speech. And that mission, we are committed with passion. Our guest speakers share their knowledge for 30 to 40 minutes, after which there's a question and answer period for the remainder of the program. You may type your questions in the chat column during the presentation to be shared afterward, or you may wait and ask your questions live at the end of the presentation. It is the responsibility of all of us to be respectful toward our guests and to all questioners. We ask that questioners not endorse particular candidates or issues, simply ask questions that can help us all learn more about our speaker and our topic. Now we will have Professor David Daniel Lamonti, Director of the Brechner Center for Freedom of Information, to introduce today's speaker.
Hi, thank you so much for the opportunity to join you remotely. It's my honor to introduce Peter Eisler, part of the 6-person reporting team that was named the winner of this year's Brechner Freedom of Information Award. Before I turn to Peter's work, just a few preface remarks. First one being, I can't let the opportunity pass without saying how sad I am, not just not to be with you in person, but not to be joined by our good friend Ralph Lowenstein. This is my first time visiting with you all since Ralph's passing. And the Brechner Center, where I'm coming to you from today, was founded in 1978. And this beautiful suite that I enjoy is the vision of Ralph Lowenstein. None of this would be here without his creativity and his imagination and his visionary leadership. And we really, really miss him a lot. So sorry that he can't be with us today. I want to give a thank you, a shout out to the judges who volunteered to go through a really impressive array of award candidates. Diane McFarland, who recently retired as Dean of the University of Florida Journalism School. Melanie Sill, who is a former executive editor of the Sacramento newspaper and the Raleigh newspaper. And last year's award winner, Christina Jewett, who's an investigative reporter with Kaiser Health News. So an illustrious group of judges to match an illustrious field of entrants. I've been doing this for 4 years now, and this is by far the deepest and the strongest field of entrants in the Brechner Reporting Award. Most of us spent the last year wearing out the seat of our sweatpants and gaining 15 pounds of pandemic weight, but America's journalists did not. They did not rest. They really doubled down on their investigative reporting, and it shows in the strength and the caliber of the award contestants that we had to choose among. The judges did unanimously choose Reuters and the team of Peter Eisler, Linda So, Jason Sepp, Grant Smith, Ned Parker, and Brad Heath for their series Dying Inside. And Dying Inside, as Peter will explain, is all about Reuters' deep exploration of the deaths of more than 7,500 people who died in jail custody in cities and counties across the country, often under circumstances that are tragically preventable, as Peter will explain. The judges were impressed by several things about the project, including when you do competitive platform diving or gymnastics, you get graded on degree of difficulty. And there was an extra degree of difficulty grade here as well, because when you're an investigative reporter and you're working on jails and you're working on healthcare, you've got two topics that government officials are especially sensitive about discussing and especially reluctant to part with public records. And so they doubled down on difficulty by reporting on healthcare in jails. Also, because the work of the Brechner Center is really focused on local, outside the Beltway journalism, we thought it was especially important to recognize this effort by a national news organization spotlighting a very local problem, a problem that can be solved by people taking action in their own cities and counties. So it's just an exemplary piece of work. Peter dropped the link to it in the chat, and I recommend that people check it out. So our speaker, Peter Eisler, is a Washington, D.C. based reporter for Reuters. He specializes in investigative projects. Before coming to Reuters, he spent 20 years as an investigative reporter with USA Today. Peter has won just about every investigative reporting award in the book, the Gerald Loeb Award, the Hillman Prize, the DuPont Columbia Award, the National Press Club Awards, National Headliner Awards, you name it. And now he can add the Brechner Award to his roster. He's a board member and the treasurer of the Fund for Investigative Journalism, which provides grants to reporters for investigative stories. And he's a volunteer with the News Literacy Project, wonderful nonprofit organization that's doing good educational outreach to kids around the country. So with that, I'm pleased to thank and formally present Brechner Award winner, Peter Eisler. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. And first of all, thank you. Thank you for having me here today. A big thank you to the Brechner Center for this tremendous honor that they've with their recognition of the series that we did, and also for the great work that you all do in promoting open access and to public records and strong freedom of information work all the way around. So we just we're very grateful and we're very honored, and I'm very happy to be here today to talk about our work. So the project that we did that won this award was a project that looked at local jails. It looked at death mortality rates in local jails across the country. And I guess sometimes it helps to sort of start by defining what we're talking about when we're talking about local jails. So in the US criminal justice system, broadly speaking, there are two places where you can be an inmate. When you get arrested and you are awaiting trial, you are typically held at a local jail. And local jails are most often run by the counties, county sheriffs. Sometimes municipal police departments will have their own local jail. And then if and when you are convicted, you go to court and you're convicted, then you go to serve your sentence in state prison. So that's and state prisons, of course, are run by the state, usually by state corrections departments. So local jails are sort of the least transparent component of the criminal justice process because they are run by local law enforcement. There's very little oversight of local jails. Many states, nearly half the states in the country, have no oversight whatsoever of local jails. They are completely autonomous, run by these local sheriffs and police departments. Sometimes they answer to the county, like a county board of supervisors or something like that. Much of the time, they get very little attention. So that's the universe that we're dealing with. And I honestly didn't know that much about local jails going into this. And we had been doing a couple of years ago another project where we were looking at the use of tasers, which are electroshock weapons that police were using. And we were looking at deaths, people who died after being shocked with a taser by police. And one of the places in the course of researching that project, one of the places that it turned out that tasers were being used a lot was in local jails. And we thought this was really interesting because state prison systems, by and large, and the entire federal prison system, they all bar tasers. They're not allowed to be used in those sorts of correctional settings, but they're pretty widely used in local jails. So when we were doing this project, we wanted to get some, we found out about a couple of local jails where people had died after being shocked with tasers. And we wanted to find out sort of generally what the mortality rates were in those jails to see if those jails were more deadly than other jails where tasers were not permitted to be used. And we went to the U.S. Justice Department. We were able to learn pretty quickly that jails report all of their deaths to the U.S. Justice Department, more specifically to the Bureau of Justice Statistics in Washington. So we went to the Bureau of Justice Statistics and, being nosy, records hungry reporters, we said, we would like to see all of the data that you've collected from all the local jails in the country. We would like to see data on every single death that's been reported to you by every local jail in the country. I don't know, let's go back 10 years. And the Justice Department got back to us with a very nicely phrased letter that essentially said, no, we don't give out this data. It's not shared with the public. It's not releasable under the Freedom of Information Act. It's not subject to open records laws. In fact, we don't even share it internally in the Justice Department with prosecutors who are filing suit against jails for violating constitutional standards of care. Even they can't see what a jail's death rate is. And we went back and we said, wait a minute, you mean it's impossible to know which jails in the country are the deadliest jails in the country, or which jails have had extraordinarily high death rates year in and year out over an extended period of time? And they said, no, you can't have that. And we did a little research and we found out that in fact, the way the law is written and the way the law is structured, that information is in fact not available to the public. And we were really irked by this. So we continued and we finished our project on tasers, and that was I think a 5 or 6 part series, and it ran. And when it came time to pick the next thing that we were going to do, I think my editor and we were sort of at the heart of this taser project, and I think that we both decided, along with our projects editor Ronnie Green, who did so much to steer this project, and my colleagues, we decided that we thought it would be really good if we could try to unravel this mystery of mortality in local jails. So in what was probably an ill-advised move in retrospect, we decided that the best way to get this data was to go out and get it ourselves. So we identified a subset of jails, 500 of the largest jails in the country. We worked with some statisticians to sort of get the right subset of jails. And we went out there were 523 jails that we went to. And we went to these 523 jails in all 50 states. And we filed records requests with them under state open records laws, which they are beholden to in local jails. They do have to comply with state open records laws. So we filed 1,500 public records requests across this universe of 500 and some odd jails. And this was, we picked the 250 largest jails in the country, every jail in the country with an average population of 750 or more inmates. And then because you have smaller states that don't have any jails that rank among the largest in the country, South Dakota, Wyoming, you name it. We also went to each state and submitted these records requests to the 10 largest jails in each state, so that we would have the largest jails nationally and the largest jails in each state. And that was the project. And it took us about 1.5 years to get all the data from all these jails. A lot of these places had never seen a public records request before. They didn't believe in many cases that they were compelled to respond to those requests. We had to do a lot of cajoling, begging, pushing, shoving, threatening with legal action. And eventually we got almost 100% of the jails to give us their data. And I'm going to share my screen right now. And I'm going to bring you to what we call the landing page for the project, which is the main page for the series. And that's the link that I posted in the chat. If any of you are interested, later on, you can click on that link, and that brings you to all of the stories and all of the data and everything. And if I'm doing this right, you all should be seeing the words "dying inside" on your screen right now. Frank, are you seeing? Yeah, I'm getting a thumbs up. Good, good.
That works.
All right, so this is the landing page for the series. And most important, I have to digress for 1 second. What we decided to do very early on was that once we got this data, if we were going to be able to get this data, we were going to put it all out there. We were going to release the entire data set to the public. And that's what we did. So here's the series. And as you can see, there were 4 main parts. These are the 4 stories here that I'm scrolling through. And we ended up, the data that we collected from these 500 plus jails, and those 500 jails account for a little more than half of the entire US jail population. So it's a big sample. You can draw some very robust conclusions from a sample that size. And we documented more than 7,500 deaths in those jails from 2008 through 2019. Some of the sort of key findings, we found that the mortality rate in those jails had climbed 35% in the decade ending in 2019. So a 35% rise in the death rate. Just in the past 3 years, the death rate rose another 8%, even as the overall population, the overall jail population in the country has declined. The mortality rate has continued to go up and up and up. So we found that 2/3 of those 7,500 plus people who died, 2/3 of them were awaiting trial and had not been convicted on any of the charges they faced. They died before they ever got their day in court. And they died, notably, while they were still presumed innocent under the law. We found that a large share of the deaths that we documented were from preventable conditions. So we found, for example, that about a quarter of the deaths were suicides, which are inherently sort of considered to be a preventable condition in a jail setting. It should be extraordinarily difficult, if not impossible, really, well, maybe not impossible, but extraordinarily difficult to commit suicide in a jail. They're supposed to assess you. If you're at risk for suicide, there are all sorts of protocols that are supposed to be in place. We found that deaths from drug and alcohol, the acute effects of drugs and alcohol had climbed very significantly in more recent years, which is no surprise, really, given what's happened with the opioid epidemic. But it's not just opioid. We saw a tremendous number of deaths, for example, from methamphetamine. By 2019, better than 1 in 10 jail deaths was from a drug overdose or an alcohol overdose. We found that sort of pulling on this string of healthcare, one of the things that we found was more than half the jails in our sample, and we believe that this plays out nationally, that you can extrapolate this. More than half the jails in the country have privatized their medical care. In other words, what they've done, because medical care is extraordinarily expensive and extraordinarily difficult, county sheriffs, for them to run a healthcare operation, to employ nurses, to employ a doctor, to deal with shifts and buy equipment, set up an infirmary, it's a big challenge. So what a lot of them have done is they've hired these big companies that are they refer to themselves as correctional healthcare contractors, and they come in and they take over the healthcare operation in a jail. We found that more than half of the jails in the country have have privatized their medical services this way. And what we found, we looked at the jails that had contracted with one of what we called the big 5, the 5 biggest companies that provide the bulk of this care in local jails. And we found that death rates in jails with privatized healthcare were anywhere from 18 to 58% higher, depending on which of these companies that they used, which raises some pretty profound questions about if you are going to contract out your healthcare, what sort of oversight is required. We found that as COVID was spreading behind bars in a frantic effort to thin jail populations, sheriffs and local prosecutors, in conjunction with local prosecutors and local judges in many cases, had released more than 170,000 jail inmates nationwide. The vast majority of these people were in jail awaiting trial, and the only reason that they were there was because they could not afford bail. So, there's great debate in this country about bail reform as a component of criminal justice reform. And essentially, the argument with respect to bail reform is that when a wealthy person gets pulled over for their car weaving around and they're suspected of driving under the influence, that person gets taken to jail, and then they post bail and they go home and they wait at home for their trial. And then when their trial, they live their life as normal, and their trial comes and they're adjudicated one way or the other. When a poor person gets caught in that same circumstance, let's say, again, we'll just stick with the same analogy, a DWI charge, the poor person gets bail set, they can't afford bail, they end up having to stay in jail, they can't go to work, they lose their job, they can't pay their rent, they lose their home, and it starts this sort of cycle. So these 170,000 people who were released nationally from jail, this is probably the grandest experiment in criminal justice reform that's ever been undertaken in this country. Never before has there been what they call a decarceration movement of this size. And time will tell, what the effects of that are. Or, the early evidence is that the vast majority of these people show up for their trials, but again, more time is needed before we can figure that out. Finally, we looked at deaths of women inmates. Even though the overall jail population in the US has been in decline, that has been driven exclusively by a fairly steep decline, or a relatively steep decline, in the number of male jail inmates. What we found is that more and more women are going to jail. In fact, the number of women jail inmates has never been higher. And the number of women dying in jails has never been higher, we found. And this is in part because most of these local jails were not intended to hold women. They were not designed to hold a substantial number of women, and they lack the resources and the facilities to meet the specific needs of women inmates. So anyway, those are the key findings. And as you can see, when you go up on this page, you can go state by state, and you can download the data on the jails that we looked at in that state. And you can see precisely who is dying, who has died, and how they died. And this is what that data looks like. So you should be seeing, Frank, give me a thumbs up if you're seeing a big spreadsheet on your screen now. Yep, okay. So this is one of the two databases that we put together with the records that we got. So this is a database that lists each of those 7,500 deaths. So it's more like 7,558, I think. And as you can see, for each death we listed, so this happens to be New Mexico, where we're at right now. This is the jail in Sandoval County, New Mexico. And you can see for each death, we have the date of death, the year of the death, the name of the person who died, the cause of death, the person's age, race, gender, who was providing the medical and mental health services in the jail at the time that they died. You'll see PB, for example. That means public. That means that the sheriff's office or some other public agency, local public health department, was providing the care. And then you'll see other initials like CHC, and those are abbreviations of different companies. That means they have a contractor, and those are the people who are doing the contracting. And then we have a bunch of coding. So we have pretty good detail on who's dying and how they died, and demographic information about them, race, ethnicity, and gender, and so forth. And then we have the other database looks like this. And this is what we call the jails database. And this is where you can look at any specific jail. Let's just, we'll scroll down here to California. To Florida rather, so I know at least some of you all are in Florida. And you can see that you can pick a jail and you can look at it. Let's say, let's pick a good one here.
Alachua County.
Alachua County. All right, here we go. We'll do Alachua County. Yes, participation is welcome. So Alachua County, as you can scroll across, we have the Alachua County Jail. And this is just a bunch of internal stuff that we have in this particular version of the database. And here you go. Starting in 2008, they had one death, and that death was a suicide. This, for each year, you see we have the number of deaths and then broken down by type. So one death, and that's one suicide. No homicides, no drugs and alcohol, no accidental deaths and illnesses, and so forth. And you just scroll across, and you'll see that, you know, for example, in 2013, they had 3 deaths, 2 suicides, and 1 illness, 1 medical death. And you can just sort of scroll across and get an idea. Now, Alachua County is not a huge jail, and it doesn't have a huge number of deaths. It's not standing out. Whereas, for example, if you scroll down here, you can just sort of eyeball your way down the column. And when you look in that same year, 2017, and you look at Miami-Dade, they had 13 deaths in their jail in 2013. So anyway, as you go across, you've got the deaths for each year. You've got the, here's the population for each year. So you can see in the Alachua County Jail, the population was up around 1,000. It's dropped off in recent years. And in 2019, it was down to 710. So their jail population in Alachua County has been in decline. Looks like relatively steady decline since about 2012. Looks like it was going up a bit. And then we could see for their medical services, so they CZ is an abbreviation for Corizon, which is a big inmate health services contractor. So they contract out their inmate health care to Corizon. Their mental health care is also contracted out to Corizon. You know, here's some information on their staffing: 338 total staff, 244 correctional staff, and so forth. So that's what the data looks like. And as I say, everybody can go and you can download the whole country, or you can download a particular state. You can see what's happening in that state. And the goal here was to be able to give policymakers, local officials, journalists, researchers, advocates, civil rights advocates, anybody who would have use for being able to track mortality at a particular jail, the tools that they needed to do it. And it's been very gratifying to see the response, because exactly what we had hoped would happen did happen. So we did our series, and that was great, and it was well received, and it prompted some reforms in some states already, and other reforms have been proposed. And it's drawn a lot of local newspapers and local TV stations have taken this data and used it to do their own stories about things that are going on in their local jails. I mean, obviously in our stories, we were only able to highlight or profile a limited number of these jails. But our hope was that, you know, people in other places would say, oh, wow, look at this. I'm looking at my jail. It's had an extraordinarily high death rate, you know, a death rate twice the national average, or 3 times the national average every year for the past decade. We're going to do our own investigation. And we've seen a lot of that from local news outlets. So that's been very gratifying. In West Virginia, for example, the ACLU used our data to find that the local jails in West Virginia all of them had very high death rates compared to the national average. And they got the attention of some state legislators, and they've introduced legislation in West Virginia, as they have also, I believe, in Mississippi, to create some statewide oversight of local jails. So, you know, from a open records point of view, from a freedom of information point of view, you know, the series has been very successful, exactly as we had hoped. So I want to leave lots of time for questions. The last thing that I'll say is that, you know, the process, I alluded to this earlier, the process of getting this information was far more difficult, far more time consuming far more tedious than we had ever expected when we set out on this mission. And we had to do a lot of pushing and pulling to get this information. But again, it's been very worthwhile, and we're very happy with the way things turned out. And again, very grateful and very honored to be recognized with this award, which is of all the kinds of awards that are out there, getting an award that's dedicated to freedom of information, to public information, which was really the genesis of this entire project and the focus of this entire project, is it's about as good as it gets. So thank you. And if folks have questions, I'd be happy to chat.
Mr. Eisner, I'd like to, on behalf of the Florida Free Speech Forum here in Gainesville, congratulate you and your team for winning the 2021 Brechner Foundation Award. And thank you for your presentation on what we have summarized as unsafe conditions in jails. We should have some interesting questions from our members and associates. Let us adhere to our mission of supporting the First Amendment by advocating, protecting, and defending freedom of speech through open and constructive dialogue. I will now turn to the chat room for written questions, and alternatively, John Riskin will recognize those persons that have hit the raise hand button in the participation section to ask their questions live.
Yes, we have several questions, and I will give each person the opportunity to ask it themselves. The first question comes from Jay Whitehead. And
I'm here, John.
And before you ask your question, if you want to ask a question in person, raise your hand. We've had a couple doing that, and I'll alternate between the written questions and the raised hand questions, since I don't know exactly when each has come in. So great. So Jay.
Thank you, John. I'm a biologist, and I'm often struck by a bumper sticker I see on cars around town here. And it says, I brake for snakes. And it always causes me to think, here's somebody speaking up for a hated part of the local fauna. Now, it causes me to wonder, why have you taken on this project to analyze a part of the community that most people don't like, don't know much about, maybe hate? I think it's worthwhile, but I don't quite understand the origin of it. Who stands up for prisoners?
Well, it's a great question. So, even in the, these sorts of, my immediate knee-jerk reaction, of course, would be, well, these people haven't been convicted of anything by and large, the people in jails. Right. A huge percentage of them are struggling with mental illness. One of the things that we talk a lot about in the series is as public mental health services have vanished in many, many communities. Public health hospitals mental health hospitals have been closed down around the country. And a lot of people with mental illness end up being warehoused in jails because they're out on the street, and sooner or later they bother somebody, they get in an argument with somebody, they do something, they're not getting their medication, they do something that someone perceives to be threatening or unruly, and they end up in jail, and they don't get the kind of treatment or care that they need in jail, and then things devolve from there. And suicide is a huge problem with people with mental illness. So, I think there's something sort of inherent in a lot of newspaper reporters, where it's sort of like sticking up for people who can't stick up for themselves. There's an element of that to it. But we felt that these are public institutions. These are a community responsibility, and that there has to be a level of accountability there. And that the notion that the people who are making decisions about funding and staffing in local jails have no data to compare how their jail is performing against the performance of jails in other like-sized communities seemed like a public policy disaster in the making.
Yeah.
So we wanted to, you know, what we found ultimately, and this was very interesting, was a lot of the jails that are particularly deadly, jails that have had very high death rates year in and year out for a decade or even more in some cases, that, you know, the sheriffs, it's not like the sheriffs in these places went out and said, oh, we're going to run a really crummy jail. You know, we want people to die in our jail. Trust me, sheriffs do not like it when people die in their jail. It leads to all sorts of, you know, even putting aside the fact that, you know, they may feel terrible about it as a human tragedy, it also causes enormous administrative headaches. It causes, in many cases, lawsuits. And these sheriffs would go to these local county commissions and say, look, you know, we need money. Our jail is overfull. We don't have a good medical clinic where we can take care of people. We can't hire mental health counselors. We don't have enough money. We don't have a staffing. We can't train our officers properly on how to watch for example, suicide risks and things like that. And that these counties, you know, these county commissions and so forth just wouldn't give them any money, because as a political imperative, if you're a locally elected official and the school needs a new wing and the jail needs a new wing, you know, making one of those things happen is going to get you votes, and making the other thing happen is not likely to get you a lot of votes. So, you know, at least this way, we found that a lot of sheriffs used our data to go in and say, look, you know, this is a real problem. Our jail has a high death rate. A lot of people are dying from suicides. Look at all the lawsuits we're getting hit with. We need to fix this. So that was our fundamental argument for doing the series. And the other thing was that, you know, again, yes, there are plenty of really bad people in jails who have done despicable, hateful things. There are also a lot of innocent people in jails who are waiting for their trial, waiting to be adjudicated, or people who certainly, even if they're not innocent, may not be guilty of something that, you know, commands a death sentence. So we wanted to speak to that, and we tried to be upfront with the case studies that we used about the backgrounds of these people. And in a lot of cases, it wasn't that hard, because in a lot of cases, the people who were dying were being held on these petty little charges for things that ultimately were traced back to, you know, a mental health breakdown or that kind of thing.
Yeah, Pete, could you stop sharing your screen, and that would allow people to see each other a little more effectively?
Oh, I'm sorry. How's
No,
that?
that's all right. That's all right. That's great.
I figured
So-
people would rather see that than see me, but you know.
The next question is from Alice Gridley. Alice, unmute yourself. Yep.
Can you hear me now? Okay.
Yep.
Yeah.
First of all, I really want to thank Peter for the work you've done and your team. I have only volunteered for a year before COVID with a group here in Gainesville. They call their title is the Interfaith Friends of Baker Detention Center. And just what you're describing is what we saw in that center. You know, the food was terrible. The health care was just pitiful. And it's gone dark on us because we can't go up there to visit now during COVID. So we are concerned. We understand that a suicide has happened. There's been a protest against the food. And you know, it's pretty bad when the prisoners won't eat at all. So I want to thank you. And I'm just curious, Baker Detention Center is small. The county is a small county. Probably wasn't in your study, but does it happen to be in your study?
So Baker Detention Center is in Alachua County, is that right?
No, in
In-
Baker County.
Oh, Baker County. Baker County,
Right.
Florida?
Yes.
I don't believe so. It doesn't sound familiar. Nope, because I'm looking here and we've got Alachua, Bay County, and Broward County as we head down in more or less alphabetical order. I'm just double checking. Yeah, it
Okay.
looks to me like we've got, because Florida has so many large jails, It looks to me like we've got, let's see, 96.
It probably was too small.
Yeah,
And-
I think we've got about 20 jails in Florida, I think, but it doesn't look to me like that one is in there. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
No, that's okay. It's one of the ICE detention centers.
Right.
And
So we didn't capture the ICE detention centers, which would be a great project to do, but we only looked at local jails, at county and city jails. We ended up not looking. We did get data from the federal prison system and also from the Department of Homeland Security on ICE detention facilities. But there's been a lot of really good reporting on that because it is a national issue. So we ended up deciding to focus really exclusively on these local places.
thank you.
Great. Now, Shirley, would you like to ask your question?
I was wondering, how are the inmates getting sufficient amount of drugs and alcohol for that to be a death sentence, a suicide problem?
So I probably should have been a little more clear on that. Typically, these overdoses happen very quickly after arrival. So people will be in the process of arrest. Sometimes people will consume drugs that they have on them as a way to try to hide it. Or sometimes the whole reason that they're arrested is because they're acting crazy out on the street because they're already in the throes of, a really bad drug-related event. And they bring them into the jail, and then they'll be in the jail for a few hours, and then they'll start to show signs of overdose. With respect to alcohol, it's often when they're coming off the alcohol, right? So if someone is severely addicted to alcohol and they stop getting alcohol all of a sudden, and they're not given proper drugs and proper medical treatment, there's a significant risk of fatality in those scenarios. So you'll see people dying from complications of alcoholism maybe a few days after arrival. You'll see people dying from drug overdoses almost immediately after arrival. And to your question, you do sometimes see people dying of drug overdoses, of acute drug overdoses, after they've been in jail for weeks. And that suggests that the jail has a significant problem with drugs and contraband being smuggled in also. But much more often, those particular kinds of deaths happen very soon after admission.
Is your hypothesis that the bail situation is such because the society doesn't want these people out on the street? They're so difficult to deal with?
Well, it's interesting. When a judge sets bail, typically it is not based on, if a judge sets bail, the judge is saying that it's safe to have this person in the community. No matter what the severity of your crime, if the judge decides that you're going to flee, then they're going to set a higher bail or they're not going to set bail at all. But if they decide to set bail, it means that they have decided fundamentally that it's okay for you to be back out in the community. It's just a matter, the bail amount is more related to your flight risk than it is to the risk that you pose to the community, because you shouldn't be out at all if you pose a risk to the community. What we're seeing is, certainly there have been a lot of studies on sort of the arbitrary nature of where bail is set for different people, depending on the judge, depending on the crime, depending on race and ethnicity, depending on all sorts of things. And I'm not an expert in that, and I haven't gone down that road. What I can tell you is that, the people who are dying in jail while they're awaiting trial, by and large, are poorer people who can't afford bail. And people with severe mental illness tend to be in that category because, they have trouble getting and holding jobs. So I think as a practical matter, or as an extension of logic, what you're saying is, yes, a lot of these people who are being held who can't make bail, I don't think it would be a stretch, although we don't have the specific data to be able to show it. I think it's an interesting hypothesis at least to be able to say, we think that it's more likely that the percentage of people who are in jail who can't make bail who have mental illness is much higher than the percentage of people who can make bail who have mental illness.
Right. Rick Gold?
Thanks so much for showing what the media can do to hold government accountable. You've provided tools for government authorities and civil society to provide some oversight where it seems to be that none has really been provided up till now. My question is dealing with the degree of adherence to either national or international standards for pretrial detention. Are these taken into account? Are people aware of them? And to what degree has civil society organizations used your data?
So one of the points that we made, it's interesting, local jails are considered an inherently local function. So the federal government has no standards whatsoever for local jails other than the standards that are dictated by the US Constitution, which, as you know, is not very specific. They're protected against inhumane, cruel punishment. They have a fundamental right. The Supreme Court has ruled back in the 70s, they have a fundamental right to basic medical care, reasonable amount of medical care. That's about it. There are no specific standards at the national level. We did a state-by-state survey to look at standards and found that I think about 23 states have roughly, just fewer than half the states have no standards and no oversight whatsoever. There's no state standards either. It's county by county, Wild West. Sheriffs develop their own policies for how the jail is run and for everything else. And as long as they stay, within those very, very rough bound constitutional boundaries, they can pretty much do what they want. Then you've got a little more than half the states, let's say roughly 27, 28 states that have some form of standards and or oversight. By some form, that can range really widely. That can range from voluntary standards that are written by the State Sheriff's Association, which obviously is not going to be a very high bar, all the way up to really rigorous standards that are enumerated in state law with a formal statewide oversight body. I mean, there are some states that are pretty good about jail oversight. With respect to international norms, the U.S. pretrial detention system has, for a long time, been a target of international humanitarian organizations. The United Nations has criticized the U.S. Pretrial detention system. As you all probably know, we incarcerate a greater percentage of our population than any other country in the world. And that is also, a big part of that is people who are awaiting trial. After our series ran, the United Nations Human Rights Office put out a statement basically saying that they were extremely concerned by the number of deaths that we had documented in local jails, particularly the fact that the vast majority of those people who are dying were pre-trial and had not been convicted of any charges that they faced, and their cases had not been adjudicated. And they do see that as a human rights concern, and they said as much. Now, I'm not going to tell you that that's going to have an extraordinary impact because I'm not sure it will. We have seen some, the last part of your question with regard to impact on public policy. As I mentioned, we have seen in several states legislative hearings or the introduction of bills and legislation to improve oversight or to set standards, or in some cases both. After the series ran, a number of influential members of Congress, House members and senators, said that they thought that this was an important issue and that they were going to work on making this data that we got, except more comprehensively. We looked at 500 of the nation's 3,000 jails. A lot of those jails are really itty bitty little jails. So those 500 jails that we looked at, they only account for 1/6 of the number of jails in the country, but they accounted for more than half the total jail population. So there were a number of people in Congress who said that they want to pass legislation that requires DOJ both not only to collect this data a little more aggressively, but also to make this data available to the public so that people can see. So the jails that continuously rack up really high inmate death rates will at least have sort of the light of day shined on that record, so people will know about it.
Very good. Alan Burns, would you like to ask your question?
First of all, thanks a lot, Pete. You're heroic, you and your team, for what you did. And I think we all learned a lot just listening to it and thinking about it. And brings up what's going on in our living room with my wife watching the trial in Minnesota and Minneapolis right now. So I was wondering if your database has information on race and ethnicity or I don't know, poverty. You mentioned poverty levels. Can you drill down more, even perhaps anecdotally, about race and ethnicity? Thanks again.
So race and ethnicity were a big challenge for us. We were able to identify the race and ethnicity of almost every inmate who died that we, almost all the 7,500 plus inmates whose deaths we documented, we were able to get race and ethnicity. What we struggled with was getting race and ethnicity breakdowns for the overall population in each jail. So you may have seen in the beginning when I was scrolling across in our database, and you can see the population in each jail, but a lot of these jails don't keep their overall population data. They don't maintain racial and ethnic breakdowns in a usable way. So to calculate comparative death rates among different races and ethnicities was ultimately pretty much impossible. We were able to say that Black people, Hispanics also, but particularly Black people, Hispanic people, are dying in numbers greater than their proportion of the overall population. In other words, we can look at the percentage of people dying who are of a particular race. So you could say that, and I can't remember the numbers offhand, but if X percent of the overall population in the country is African American and Y percent of the people who are dying in jails are African American, then you can see that African American people, Black inmates, are dying in larger numbers. What you can't see is whether the death rate among Black or African American or Latino inmates, or pick any race or ethnicity, is higher as a rate than it is among, for example, white inmates. And that's something that was constraining. And that's one of the things, that people in Congress have talked about, is trying to get better underlying data so that you can do a better job. And, this is not a limitation that's unique to our data set. This is a limitation that even DOJ, as I mentioned at the outset, they collect all this data and they won't release jail by jail data, but they do release aggregate data nationally every few years. So, they'll tell you that we had, 3,000 inmate deaths in a particular year. And they will tell you in many cases, but not all cases, even how many deaths jail inmates died in a particular state, but they won't tell you which jails they died at in that state. So, you take a state like California and they'll say, California had 1,000 inmate deaths last year, but you don't know whether 700 of those deaths were at one jail and the other 300 deaths were at the other 50 jails, or whether it was spread relatively evenly and there's no bad actor. Anyway, even when DOJ puts out its nationally aggregated data on jail deaths, they also have the same problem. They cannot calculate race-specific death rates. Same problem. They don't have the denominator. They don't know what the the total number of inmates of any particular race or ethnicity in a jail. So that was a limiting factor. Again, we did find that, Black inmates die in numbers higher than their share of the overall community. We did find that women inmates were dying in much higher numbers, but we weren't able to go much beyond that.
Very good. We have two more questions. One from Tom Bullock. Well, we just got one more. Tom Bullock, would you like to ask your question? Tom? You immutably.
Here we are.
Here we are.
I was wondering that you said that we had more deaths due to the public, the hired medical providers. Do you know why?
It's hard to say. This was a question we spent a lot of time trying to unravel. And the bottom line is that we can't say why with any certainty. There are theories that different people who are experts in this field advanced. There have always been concerns about the financial model of privatizing medical care. So the way it works in most of these jails, when they hire the contractor says, okay, we will provide you with all the medical services you need for your inmates, and we're going to charge you X dollars per inmate. So if your average population is 1,000 inmates, and we're going to charge you $300 per inmate, which is low. Or $3,000 per inmate, or whatever it is. Your bill is going to be $300,000 or $3 million or whatever it is. And that's what the jail pays. And the thing is that when you have a financial model that's set up that way, every dollar that the company saves on care is a dollar that goes directly to their bottom line. In other words, if they're getting paid a set amount, the less money they spend on care, the more money they make in profit. So there's an inherent, what some of the people will tell you is that there's an inherent sort of financial incentive for these companies to skimp on care. One of the places that we saw a lot of problems is in these companies' unwillingness to hospitalize people, right? Because it's so extraordinarily expensive. As soon as one of these companies puts someone in the hospital, if they can't handle their medical needs there at the jail and they have to hospitalize someone, the company is often on the hook, depending on how the contract is structured, for those hospital costs. So if you've got someone who goes into the hospital who needs a very expensive procedure, then that company's profits are going to start to shrink. So there's a lot of thought that may be part of the reason, is that the sort of the financial incentives built into the contracting structure. It's not necessarily that cut and dried. It sounds very easy until you hear the companies talk about it. And what the companies will tell you is, if we don't give someone the care that they need and they have a poor outcome, we get sued and we lose a lot more money, or the county gets sued. And if that's happening all the time, our contract's not going to get renewed, because the county is not going to like being sued all the time. They're going to find a different healthcare provider. So they say, they sort of dismiss this notion that there's a financial incentive to skimp on care. They would tell you just the opposite, that they have an incentive not to. But we did interview a lot of employees of these companies who said that they were very heavily pressured not to send inmates to the hospital. And we found many cases anecdotally where people were dying because of care that they didn't get proper care. So for example, we saw a number of cases where people got blood clots and they were begging, they were in agony, begging, blood clot in your leg, whatever, begging to go to the hospital. And the healthcare providers just said, no, you're faking it. It's a cramp, whatever. They didn't diagnose it properly. And then that blood clot goes into their lungs or goes into their brain and they die. We saw, a number of those sorts of cases. We saw cases where people died from things like kidney failure. We saw some really horrific cases. We saw a case where a person died from gangrene. If you've ever been around someone who's got gangrene, who's got a wound that has reached that stage, that is not something that is easily missed. And yet we saw cases where it was missed, where infections and those sorts of things, really wreaked havoc with people. So, anecdotally, I can tell you, certainly we found cases and we found memos and internal memoranda that said, cut down on the number of people who are going to the hospital, stop sending people to the hospital. Or where, there was one jail, good sized jail, 1,000 inmates, and they had one part-time retired psychiatrist serving an inmate population of 1,000 people. And he came in like a couple days a week for a couple of hours. People who were, so we found a lot of that sort of thing anecdotally. But the bottom line is that we don't have the data or the ability to draw any hard conclusions on why, with any certainty, on why the death rates are higher when the jail care is privatized, just that it is.
Okay, Lynn
Well,
Holt has,
Go ahead.
Lynn Holt has a question.
Yeah,
Lynn?
thank you for your presentation, which I found very interesting. Rick Gold, I think, asked some of it, but I want a little more specific response if you could. Did you see any states with oversight statutes that could be used as a model for other states in making local jails more accountable to the public? You mentioned
Yes.
several states that were better than
Yes,
others.
we saw states and we also saw local county level oversight mechanisms that were quite effective. For example, in Denver, Colorado, they have a local office that specifically oversees the jails. In Los Angeles, they have they've empowered their inspector general to be able to do a lot of oversight of the jail system. Now, Los Angeles County is the biggest jail system in the country. I mean, tens and tens of thousands of inmates. So yes, we did see models, and there are people out there. There are model standards that are available for communities and state at both the county level and the state level that can be used. If legislators or county officials want to put standards in place, there are plenty of resources out there, plenty of models that they can use as a basis for their own systems. And there are researchers. There's one woman, for example, in Texas, a woman named Michelle Deach, who we quoted in the series. And her whole specialty, she's at the University of Texas at the LBJ School of Public Policy. And her whole area of research is local jail oversight. And she has put together several studies where she captures model statutes from different places and measures the success rate of different types of oversight, and has captured model statutes from different places and put them together in studies so that people can look and see, what works and doesn't work. So, the answer is yes, that stuff is out there. Absolutely.
Okay, one brief question from Jay, and then we can wrap it up. You're muted, Horace. So.
Thank you. Thank you, Pete, for a wonderful presentation. And it brings to mind the question if there's any move afoot to dig into the statute that prevents the Bureau of Statistics of the Department of Justice from releasing any of this information. Why did that come
We did
about?
after. Oh, sorry. Go ahead. I interrupted.
No, how did it come about, and is there a move to change it?
So it's interesting. The statutory provision that prevents the release of this data had nothing to do specifically with this data. This is like a classic story of unintended consequences. So the person who wrote the people who wrote the law that requires the reporting of these deaths, called the Deaths in Custody Reporting Act, DICRA, which was initially passed in the year 2000, it was a bipartisan bill. It was passed by with a Republican senator and a Democratic senator as the two chief sponsors. And they said basically, okay, we're going to go out and we think that people should be collecting information on jail deaths and deaths in police custody. That same law is also the law under which police departments have to report deaths in the course of arrest-related deaths to the Justice Department. And all of that data is collected by the Bureau of Justice Statistics. Well, the Bureau of Justice Statistics is one of several what they call federal statistical agencies. So the Census Bureau, for example, is a federal statistical agency. And those agencies, because they gather so much personal information and so much what they refer to as personally identifiable information, have a special statute that governs the use of their data. And it generally says that it cannot be used in any way that would make anybody personally identifiable. And it's not used in any way that can be used for law enforcement purposes, so that they can't be subpoenaed. So, for example, you know, when the Census Bureau comes to your house, if you're one of the people that they really zero in on, they ask you a lot of very personal stuff, how much money you make and all sorts of things about your child and family situations and that kind of thing. Nobody can go to the Census Bureau and file a FOIA request, a Freedom of Information Act request, and say, I want to see, you know, all the personal information on every single person in Florida so that they can find out, you know, everything they want about Jay Whitehead, for example. Well, the Bureau of Justice Statistics is a federal statistical agency, and they are governed by this statute. So when Congress passed the law, they didn't say who should collect the data. They said, hey, Justice Department, start collecting this data and issue some reports on it. And the Justice Department says, well, we have a statistical division in our department. It's the Bureau of Justice Statistics. They already collect crime data and all sorts of other data, and we're going to give this job to them. Well, as soon as the Justice Department handed that job to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, it meant that the data would never be released in any sort of, you know, in any sort of facility specific level. And, you know, did the Justice Department do that knowingly and on purpose? We were never able to get the people who made those decisions 20 years ago to talk about it. But what they did say was they said that there was a lot of pushback and a lot of belief that if they did start identifying specific jails, more death rates at specific jails, that the jails would not report the data. That if the jails knew that this data was going to be used to hold their feet to the fire or to embarrass them or to as a basis for legal action against them, that they would stop complying. And the federal government doesn't really have a way to make them comply. It is at its heart, ultimately, to some extent, a voluntary scenario. So there wasn't a lot of appetite to go down that road either. But as a result, and we know that the sheriff's associations and places like that were not particularly keen on having any sort of identifiable data. And we ran into this problem when we were collecting the data. There were a lot of places, a lot of jurisdictions where they said, we're not going to tell you the names of the dead inmates, or we're not going to tell you the causes of death because it violates their right to privacy. Well, in fact, there is no right to privacy after you die. But, you know, we can't litigate that kind of thing with 500 different jails at once. So we had to, you know, sort of beg and push and cajole and threaten and beat our chests and bluster and do whatever we could to get them to give whatever we could get. But in some cases, we had to walk away without, for example, the names.
Yeah.
Great, thanks.
With
Honest.
that, John, thanks to all of you for your interesting questions. Thanks especially to our guest speaker, Pete Eisler, for his insight into unsafe conditions inside jail. We ask that you join us online for the next meeting of Florida Free Speech Forum on May 10th, when our program will be presented by Sherry Kitchens. If you wish to comment on today's meeting or to offer suggestions or to help Zooming, please email us at floridafreespeechforum@gmail.com. For more information about the forum, please visit our website at floridafreespeechforum.org. Be sure to tell your friends to join us next month.
Please.
Thanks to all of you for joining us today, and the Florida Free Speech Forum is now adjourned.